So, the title of my presentation today is Beautiful and Ugly Descriptions of Illness. There will be quite a lot of quotes, but don't worry if you don't catch up the details. I will give you a complete reference list at the end of the talk. There seems to be an increasing tendency in modern Scandinavian descriptions of illness to present negative emotions related to illness. The traditional approach was for the sick person to take on a more positive and heroic role, making descriptions of illness more beautiful and more harmonious. One challenge in autobiographical illness narratives is that patients experience pressure to write or express in other ways rigorous, orderly, and meaningful stories about their own or family members' illness. Illness descriptions often convey a message of acceptance and personal growth related to illness experience. But increasingly, illness is now being described in terms of the patient's anger, anxiety, and bitterness, or what we might call ugly feelings. I will talk about how these ugly feelings are reflected in illness descriptions, both fictional and autobiographical, both by patients themselves and in doctors' encounters with angry or hateful patients. In my conclusion, I will discuss the possible reasons for this development in literature. But let us first look at some typical characteristics of the so-called beautiful and ugly descriptions of illness. The following section is called Beautiful Illness Descriptions. In the 1970s, a period we can describe as an early Scandinavian phase of the history of illness literature, there was a tradition of autobiographical illness narratives, so-called pathographies. The aim of these was to provide help, support, and encouragement to people with a similar illness to that of the author. Not surprisingly, these books presented a positive attitude with a focus on recovery and a good quality of life. Anne Hunsaker Hawkins calls these pathographies testimonials, and she writes, "The intent of these pathographical testimonies seems to be simply to tell the story of an illness experience, focusing primarily on the author's thoughts, feelings, and as complementary to medical treatment that is generally accepted as appropriate and helpful. Since they are often written with the express purpose of helping others, pathographies in this first group can be seen as motivated by didactic or altruistic principles." The pathographical testimonies thus describe illness with a focus on sharing knowledge with others. The didactic aspect may be realized as specific advice for treatment, but perhaps especially as reflections on ways of dealing with illness. The author communicates knowledge or insights that medical expertise cannot provide, knowledge that is unique to the patient herself. The didactic project creates continuity by reinstating the patient as a person with resources and agency rather than a passive recipient of care. This kind of presentation may also imply that the patient matures and develops as a person. Anne Hunsaker Hawkins says, and I quote, "It turns on the belief that one can undergo a process of transformation so profound as to constitute a kind of death to the old self and rebirth to a new and very different self." End of quote. A counterpart to Anne Hawkins' pathographical testimonies can be found in Arthur Frank's so-called quest and restitution stories from The Wounded Storyteller from 1995. The restitution narrative provides a focus on and hope for recovery, while the quest narrative is linked to a view of illness as a journey that leads to spiritual strength and mental growth. In Frank's words, and I quote, "The quest narrative tells self-consciously of being transformed. Undergoing transformation is a significant dimension of the storyteller's responsibility." End of quote. These stories also belong to the early phase of illness literature, with a desire to emphasize the positive aspects of illness. Some patients go so far as to say that they are pleased that they have had the illness because of the experience it gave them. In an article from 2006, the Norwegian doctors Holmøy and Frick wrote, and I quote, Pathographies can present an image of patients as strong, resourceful people or champions, which is in stark contrast to the reality most people experience. End of quote. However, the idea of the noble patient is not a modern phenomenon, but has a long history. It is found in cultural expressions such as that of Mimi in Puccini's opera La Bohème, who, when dying of tuberculosis, comforts those around her. And it is also found in older examples of popular culture, as in a Norwegian folk song from around 1850, that describes how a young boy dying from tuberculosis forgives the people who have mistreated him and prays that they will be spared his own fate. In the words of this popular ballad, there were many of them in his thoughts when he prayed his last prayer. With difficulty and in pain he whispered it out, "O Lord, do not let the evil plague come to them." Depictions of the noble, almost sublime patient are also a modern literary phenomenon. Reidar Ekner's book from 1974, called in Swedish Efter flera tusen rad, which means after 1,000 lines here meaning a sort of treatment in the treating cancer patients, is one of the earliest examples of a Scandinavian pathography, and it describes just such an exalted and sublime patient. Ekner's book consists of a cycle of poems about the critical illness of his daughter, Torun, who died of cancer at the age of 8. Ekner himself was a literary historian at Stockholm University, but also a poet and a translator, and later on married to the Norwegian poet Eldurid Lunden. The book is very well written, its main literary qualities being an impressive use of stylistic language that shifts between prose and poetry, striking metaphors, the projection of Eknes himself as a vulnerable father, and a complex yet brief description of a seriously ill child. The poetic prose style of Just One More Line gives the cycle an exploratory and searching mode. It is a text of just over 100 pages divided in 4 parts. Each part consists of lines of free verse, which use prose to tell us about the daughter's end-of-life situation. The story that takes shape is brutal and sad. The father tells how his daughter got cancer at an early age, but was treated, cured, and sent home to resume life without illness. But after a year without symptoms, there are signs that the disease has returned. The father's poem about his daughter is full of despair and hopelessness. The girl's family knows that the disease is incurable, and the narrator wonders how she's able to fight for her life despite being so weak physically. Life is presented as an extremely powerful force that is vibrant until the very end. And at the same time, the little girl is portrayed with an admirable, almost inhuman mental strength and maturity one does not expect of a child. It is a heroic portrait that takes shape of a terminally ill child who comforts the adults and bravely replies with understatement when someone asks how she is in her obviously painful and tough illness. A sequence of the cycle of poems, dated the 6th of June 1973, runs as follows. You have given light and joy to your family, and you still do. You have an inner strength that comforts those around you. With big eyes, you look at the grown-ups who get annoyed like children. They cry, moan, and lose their grip. Things are tough for you, but you take it in your stride. When I ask how it feels, you answer, not too bad, even if you're in pain, and pretty good when the pain eases off. You overlook your pain. Bring me my drawing book. I want to draw. Your hand is shaking, but you can still manage it sometimes. This one is for Grandma. Life goes on here and now. We only have this one life. Teach me your patience, your perseverance. Reidar Ekner's cycle of poems about Torun is an early example of the tendency to project sick people in positive terms and with heroic qualities. The poem takes the form of a literary monument to the dead child, and the writing reminds us of a eulogy. Ekner's text lies somewhere between an elegy, a lament of a dead person, and a eulogy spoken at a funeral. Perhaps we could consider just one more line as an exploration, experimentation, and modernization of the elegy genre. Ekner's sometimes prosaic descriptions of treatment and practical tasks transcends the sadness and complaining and brings us into an everyday sphere that creates a more holistic, but nonetheless strikingly beautiful and flawless image of the sick and dead child. This was the end of the section about beautiful illness descriptions. Now let's move on to the next section, which I've called hateful patients. Relating to patients or family members who are bitter, anxious, or hateful can be very challenging. However, this problem is not unknown in healthcare literature, and in medicine there are words to describe difficult patients. In 1978, G.A. Gross published the article Taking Care of the Hateful Patient, which challenged the myth of the grateful and brave patient. In his work as a doctor, Gross had observed a number of patient types who did not demonstrate any of these qualities, but a common feature was a strong aversion to the care provider. Gross explains this as follows. Hateful patients are not those with whom the physician has an occasional personality clash. As defined here, they are those whom most physicians dread. The insatiable dependency of hateful patients leads to behaviors that group them into four stereotypes: dependent clingers, entitled demanders, manipulative help rejectors, and self-destructive deniers. Gross categorization may seem kind of brutal, and we inevitably think and hope that this is an outdated view of patients. The most outdated thing about the article, however, is perhaps Gross' lack of nuances, especially the fundamental and sort of rigid doctor-patient dichotomy. The article reveals several cases of hateful patients, and the reader's sympathy lies unilaterally with a doctor who has to endure these difficult consultations. What happens when the relationship between doctor and patient has become so democratic that it is difficult for the doctor to maintain his medical competence and authority? Doctors have high expectations of the ethical standards associated with caring for patients, and when communication is challenging because patients are angry, afraid, or impatient, doctors may find it difficult to deal with their own negative emotions. Since patient knowledge is increasing and Scandinavia now has a patient culture that ensures patients' rights and empowers them to take control of their own health, we find patients who challenge the doctor's medical competence during consultations. The fact that patients are not necessarily only grateful to their care providers, but also angry, hateful, and demanding, is reflected in current illness literature. The Norwegian author, Nina Lykke, presents a fictitious GP who expresses dissatisfaction with the reversal of the doctor-patient hierarchy, saying, "What's happened to the respect people used to have for doctors? Oh, how I miss it. Oh, how I hate these new times, with the individual at the center, and the customer at the center, and the consumer at the center, and service and quality everywhere." Nina Lykke's GP uses the word hate, which fits in well with Gross' rhetoric from 30 years earlier. Hate is a word that does not naturally belong in the medical discourse, and if you follow Sian Nagai's thoughts about ugly, degrading feelings, not even in fiction. Knowing what lies behind these ugly feelings and learning different strategies to relate to them can be helpful, and autobiographical illness narratives can be an important source of first-hand experience in this respect. And I will now go on to talk about so-called ugly illness stories. In patient narratives too, descriptions of bitterness, anger, anxiety, hostility, and depression have been underrepresented in favor of acceptance and harmony. The Danish researcher Karsten Stage at Aarhus University writes about this in his book Networked Cancer, Affect, Narrative and Measurement, a book published in 2017. Karsten Stage argues that cancer stories on social media have particular value and importance because they include difficult feelings such as anger, loneliness, and negativity. Stage is particularly interested in how social media cancer stories have both financial and emotive value, and emphasizes these qualities as part of this value-creating project. He writes, "The book, It, will argue that social media cancer narratives do not only produce a sense of relief, but can also play a role in the production of negativity, anger, irritation, sorrow, and loneliness. Social media and cancer narratives are, in other words, also involved in the production of less vitalizing or ambiguous intensities and ugly feelings." End of quote. The growth of digital platforms has changed the way people communicate about illness and enabled broader, more powerful, and unfiltered ranges of emotions. The possibility of communicating one's own illness experience without using the publishing industry may be one of the reasons why ugly pathographies have become increasingly common. From 2000, they increased in Norway in relation to autobiographical illness narratives. The sociological researchers Tjora and Sandaune, Norwegian researchers, state, and I quote, "Around the year 2000, the number of digital patient narratives increased drastically due to the offspring of Word 2.0. In Norway alone, there were as many as 156 registered patient associations in 2019, and several of their websites have links to personal illness stories. In just 3 of these, the Norwegian Cancer Society, the Neuromuscular Disorders Association of Norway, and Mental Health Norway, we find more than 250 digital patient stories. These digital narratives are edited much less than print publications, and ugly feelings are more common. One example is a blog by the Norwegian lady Marit Ulriksen. The blog is called either Sykehjørnet or in English, In the Sick Corner, and Marit Ulriksen published regularly from 2011 until she died in 2013. She writes about her anger at other people's small problems, and anger rooted in a feeling of bitterness over the disease that has afflicted her. She confronts the stereotypical understanding of what it means to be a patient and, as in her case, to be seriously ill with cancer. She writes, "I'm not so grateful, so positive, so optimistic and inspiring. On the contrary, I'm sour, bitchy, angry, bitter, dismissive, ungrateful, and very often angry. And today, if it can be called day already, I intend to give insight into that part of being sick as well." The explicit openness about ugly feelings makes this harrowing reading. Marit Ulriksen's blog is not always pleasant to read, but its basic openness and honesty helps to put the negative outbursts into perspective. No one who reads Ulriksen's blog blames her for what she writes, and the reason is that the negative words, the anger, the bitterness, and the envy, are presented within a clear and transparent context. A recurring theme in many autobiographical illness narratives is that the disease represents a form of physical, sometimes mental decline and at the same time provides the patient with positive insights. We have seen an example of this in Reidar Ekner's book about Toren. In the Norwegian novel Pust for meg, which means breathe for me, by the Norwegian author Cecilie Enger, this view is, however, is both depicted and confronted. In a conversation between the young artist Synne and the middle-aged Dr. Carla, diametrically opposite views of the significance of the illness are presented. Synne represents ideas about growth, maturity, and insights as a result of the experience of a severe illness. Synne says, for many people, their illness gives them an insight that they did not have before they fell ill. Consequently, we may say that a disease or an injury, just like art, can somehow clear our eyes so that we can see other things when we are ill. However, Carla, the older and more resigned doctor, is skeptical, and she answers Synne. I don't agree that illness necessarily brings great insight. I feel I can see just the same variety of insights in sick people as in healthy people. And what about people who are ill for years, who are reminded of their illness every single day? They don't forget it, sitting in a wheelchair or full of cancer or being ill because they missed the child or the father, I said. Perhaps the only insight we all share is that we're basically all alone with our fate. The opposing views of Synne and Carla are symptomatic of a development in the pathography genre, where the focus on the sick person as exceptional and heroic is toned down in favor of an everyday description that explicitly presents emotions such as fear, bitterness, envy, and anger. I have chosen to call such texts ugly pathographies when it comes to autobiographical illness stories. These ugly emotions, as I mentioned, are first to be found in Sian Nagai's book Ugly Feelings from 2006. Depression, along with anger and envy, is one of 7 negative feelings that Nagai discusses in depth. Negative feelings not only include a negative response to other people and the world around one, but are also somewhat unattractive in an aesthetic sense. Nagai says, moods like irritation and anxiety, for instance, are defined by a flatness or ongoingness, entirely opposed to the suddenness on which Aristotle's aesthetics of fear depends. And unlike rage, which cannot be sustained indefinitely, less dramatic feelings like envy and paranoia have a remarkable capacity for duration. End of quote. Such negative feelings have previously been downplayed in fiction and literary criticism in favor of emotions with a certain prestige, or in Nagai's words, grounder and more prestigious passions. Ugly pathographies include not only the large, unique, boundary-breaking experiences that illness often initiates, but also the small, repetitive, prosaic, everyday events that are also part of the broader picture of being ill. Ugly pathographies express anger, envy, hatred, bitterness, and anxiety related to the overall experience of being ill or of being a family member. They have an existential dimension and color the illness experience in a way that can feel all-consuming. The individual patient or family member may find it difficult to express their anger, hatred, or bitterness. Nagai not only discusses familiar feelings, but also coins the neologism stuplimity, which plays on a link between sublime and stupidity. The adjective sublime is a cornerstone of art criticism. To refer to a literary work as sublime implies that the text is on an elevated level, transcending everyday life and prose style. To characterize the text as stupid, however, implies a view of it as simple, dumbing down, and destructive. The sublime has been a hallmark of great art. Stuplimity, on the other hand, has to do with how prosaic, pejorative, repetitive feelings and behavior acquire an important function and are sublimated through art. When negative, degrading, often shameful, and culturally despised feelings are involved in an existential boundary-breaking experience represented by illness, this leads to the creation of what we could call a stuplium text and a personal experience of sublimity. There are several examples of this in Scandinavian contemporary descriptions of illness, including the final novel by the Norwegian-Swedish author Beate Grimstrud from 2020, which is entitled I Suggest That We Wake Up. Grimstrud was born in Norway but lived in Sweden for a long time and is therefore considered both a Norwegian and a Swedish author. She was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2018 and died in July 2020. The main character in the plot in the novel are based on Grimstrud's own illness experience, but the author also includes obvious fictional elements that enable a wide range of emotions related to falling ill. Envy and irritation are two such feelings regularly seen in the main character, the middle-aged playwright Wildeberg. Nesby writes the following about envy in relation to gender and class, and I quote, "It is impossible to divorce the pervasive ignobility of this feeling from its class associations or from its feminization, which might explain why the envy subject is so frequently suspected of being hysterical." End of quote. But envy is also very relevant in relation to health and disease. The healthy person possesses something desirable that the sick person does not have, namely good health. To compare oneself as a sick person with a healthy person is a dangerous sport. Feelings of anger, injustice, and envy obviously accompany such an approach. The ill person may envy the person who is healthy, or the person who is less ill. Both perspectives are revealed by the breast cancer patient Vilda in Grimstrud's novel, who states, "What did they say? Is it ugly or necessary to compare? If you're paralyzed in both arms, then you don't envy the person who isn't paralyzed in either arm. No, you direct your envy towards the person who is paralyzed in only one arm. She is jealous of people with mild breast cancer, cancers that do not spread to the lymph nodes, people who do not need chemotherapy, those who only get radiation treatment and are encouraged to work full-time at the same time. Close your eyes and get radiation treatment for 15 minutes every day before or after work. It's much like going to the gym, or dropping by the hospital during the lunch break for 5 weeks. You may not even need to tell your boss that you have lost your breast. Maybe they just removed a slice of cake. It was all over pretty quickly. You look back on it with a slight grimace. The statistics are on your side. Do people with mild breast cancer even need to be afraid? Is there a scale for reasonable emotional outbursts?" Nesby places envy in a larger politicized context, while she points out how the mean and ugly aspects of this emotion rob it of institutional power. She says, and I quote, "Moralized and uglified to such an extent that it becomes shameful to the subject who experiences it, envy also becomes stripped of its potential critical agency, as an ability to recognize and antagonistically respond to potentially real and institutionalized forms of inequality." End of quote. This corresponds to the envy expressed in Grimstrud's novel, where the impact of envy is exclusively in the form of a subjective, almost private feeling. Another ugly feeling that occurs frequently in the novel is irritation. The title reveals an impatience expressed in irritation that someone, maybe the reader, or maybe the author, or perhaps even the main character, does not realize what is happening. The title of the novel suggests that we are in a dormant, benumbed state, a form of innocence as represented by sleep, and that we must confront reality. And in this book, the illness is reality. Perhaps an extension of this awakening metaphor, we can call the book a wake-up call. We are not only led out of a state of innocence, from the land of the healthy to the land of the sick, to rephrase Susan Sontag's famous metaphor, as you all probably know. But we also come to realize that this is a place where we actually do not want to be, neither in a concrete nor in a figurative sense. The novel puts into words the simplest and most banal reaction to illness, namely that we wish it had not happened and we want to get better. Most of us would prefer not to have the illness experience, despite the ideals of positive thinking of the pink ribbon movement, for instance. Irritation is also a state of mind that involves mild anger, often directed at something vague and indefinable. The link between irritation and anger makes sense. Aristotle refers to irritation as an excess of anger in his work, The Nicomachean Ethics. It is an anger that is not channeled through violence, discussions, or other explicit forms of expression. Instead, irritation seeps out through a complex set of words, actions, and behaviors. Irritation is a subtle form of anger that, because it lacks an object, also lacks the clear but often brutal forms of expression of stronger anger. The word irritation originates from medicine, where it indicates that something is making a person's skin red or sore. Sienna Nagai makes an interesting point of this physical, mental double meaning. She writes, "For the split between the bodily sensation, that is soreness, and the emotional quality, that is mild anger, foregrounds irritation's liminality or instability as an emotional response. Whether irritation is defined as an emotional or physical experience, synonyms for it tend to apply equally to psychic life, and life at the level of the body, and particularly to its surfaces of skin." Irritation is a link between mental and physical states. Irritation as a link between mental and physical states becomes more meaningful when applied to a text about illness. Vilde, in Beate Grimsrud's novel, experiences of bodily change, of numbness and soreness following the breast cancer operation and removal of the lymph nodes, cause not only despair and fear, but also anger that manifests itself in irritation. Anger at the bodily changes and fear of what will happen are ventilated through a vague but recurring irritation that is explicitly linked to the low status of the feeling. Vilde is described as follows. "She has had a short temper for the past few days. Didn't she want to hit? Oh, that is her wife. Didn't she want to hit O the other day when she was noisily eating an apple? Noisy apple eating is sheer terror. To be a victim of that terror is not to be afflicted by pain, fear, or sorrow, but by real irritation, the lowest of all feelings." Another example of an illness narrative with strong negative emotions side by side with permanent feeling of love is a Norwegian author Olaug Nilsen's novel Tung Tids Tale, which has been translated as a tale of terrible times. The book deals with her life together with her 11-year-old son, Daniel, who has multiple disabilities. Daniel's behavior is described as violent, uncontrollable, and frightening, and Olaug, his mother, reacts with anger. she says. You pull me close to you, you hug me tight, and I like being hugged, it doesn't happen too often. But today you are boisterous and laughing, and you want to pinch me too. You grab at my eyes. I carefully push your hand away. You grab my mouth and pull it while you howl with laughter. Of course it hurts. I push again and need to get away to calm down, but I can't get loose. You hold on. First you pull the neck of my sweater, then you grab the front of my bra and pull me down with it. I get angry. I need to get away. I feel the anger running through my whole body. Now I have to get away, but you're strong and hold me tight. I determinedly push you down and sit in peace for a moment on the edge of the sofa and calm down before I start to get up. But before I manage to stand up, you throw yourself at me and put your legs around my stomach, holding me tight again and laughing loudly. Now I grab your legs firmly, pull you off. I have to get away, to count to 10 at least, to breathe. Now I know you've got to go outside. You've got to go out and use your body immediately because of this. End of quote. This type of anger challenges some general and legal views of what is legitimate. Anger is not an acceptable feeling in bringing up children, and especially when the child has special care needs and when the angry person is the mother. Olaug's anger towards Daniel is an ugly feeling, as she also admits herself. A Tale of Terrible Times from 2018 is an illness narrative that tells of ugly and tabooed feelings in a mother of a severely disabled son. In parallel with this aspect, the novel also has a strong political profile, which is full of irritation, but still appears to be justified and politically correct. This political dimension was also emphasized in many of the reviews and responded to by Norwegian politicians. The book's critique of the system links it to the early pathographies, but the openness about how illness can also lead to irritation, anger, and fear in encounters with a sick person or family members, as seen in Nielsen and Grimsrud, indicates a tendency to present the whole complex picture of sublime and ugly feelings and actions. And I will now end up by the last section, which I've called From Coherence to Chaos, ? The Israeli narratologist Shlomit Rimankinen argues that there has been a tendency to favor positive, rigorous chronological pathographies at the expense of despairing, chaotic, and furious ones. Rimankinen writes, and I quote, "Pathography is generally epideictic, when its repeated gestures enunciate values preferring certain sorts of accounts over others, but also, for the same reason, preferring certain sorts of experience." End of quote. This phenomena is particularly well known from breast cancer, where the so-called pink ribbon movement, despite much positive work, has been criticized for promoting a culture where, as the researcher Bach puts it, and I quote, "cheerfulness is more or less mandatory." End of quote. Expectations of being ill have changed historically. Previously, seriously ill people normally stayed in bed, while today greater demands are placed on patients. Hawkins writes, and I quote, "The expectation of our culture is not only that the sick will continue to function as best and as long as they can, and modern pharmacology has made this possible, but that their illness will serve as an opportunity for bravery and heroism." End of quote. The tendency to emphasize heroism in modern society is intensified in the case of anticipated death. Death is almost invisible in modern Western European societies, and when death manifests itself in the light of serious illness, it is a shocking experience that is difficult for many people to handle. The encounter with death becomes an opportunity to demonstrate heroic qualities through inner growth. Seal writes in an article from 1995, "The traditional emphasis on courage in the face of external danger now becomes courage to explore and express the dying self in a drama of inner adventure." End of quote. The demand and supply of beautiful illness stories shows how the literary market helps to shape texts. The publisher acts as a gatekeeper for the literary project, and publishers and authors negotiate with each other to create a readable and saleable product. The author has a book she wants published, the publisher wants a book that will make profit, and both of them want the text to be read. In the case of illness narratives, the brutal reality must be toned down so as not to offend the readers. There are various ways to do this, but generally it is a matter of not placing too much emphasis on the negative and difficult aspects, but also including optimism, hope, and positive universal values that transport stories of physical and mental deterioration to stories of personal formation and growth. At the same time, there is now increasing openness about things that were previously taboo, including illness and death. The development of the internet has given us access to many unfiltered and unedited personal stories, the so-called reality literature, with its unclear distinction between fact and fiction, has created readers with a higher threshold of tolerance and even expectations of authentic descriptions of what are obviously challenging life situations. Perhaps fictional depictions of illness that present anger, sadness, hatred, and envy are a response to these reader expectations, combined with a desire for the writing to have a therapeutic effect on the sick author. Perhaps it is not correct, after all, to speak of a transition from coherence to chaos. Disease, as previously depicted, was not in reality coherent and harmonious, any more than today's patients can be said to be in a completely chaotic world. Perhaps it might be more correct to describe this as a form of complexity, where today's descriptions of illness allow for the expression of the broad diversity of emotions experienced by seriously ill people. Thank you so much.